Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we follow the long, slow rise of Rome. We trace how a small cluster of huts on a muddy hill beside a river grew over many centuries into the greatest power the ancient world had ever known. Tonight is the story of how Rome rose to power, told gently and slowly, from a village by the Tiber to an empire that ruled the sea. It began, the old stories say, with two brothers and a river. Long ago, on the banks of the Tiber, in the hills of central Italy, two infant twins were set adrift to die. Their names were Romulus and Remus, and the legends tell that they were the sons of a god and a princess, cast out by a fearful king who wished them gone. But the river did not drown them. It carried them gently to the shore. There, the old tale goes, the twins were found and suckled by a she-wolf who kept them alive in her den, until a herdsman discovered them and raised them as his own. They grew strong and bold, and in time they learned who they truly were, and they resolved to found a city of their own upon the hills where they had been saved. That moment, the legend holds, was the beginning of Rome. But the founding was not without sorrow. The brothers quarrelled over which hill should hold the city, and over who should rule it. And in the end, Romulus killed his brother Remus. And so, Rome, by its own ancient legend, was born in the blood of brothers, named for the one who survived. Romulus became its first king, and the small settlement on the hills took his name, in the year traditionally remembered as 753 before the Common Era. The Romans told an even older story behind this one, reaching back to the fall of a distant city. They believed that long before Romulus, a hero had fled the burning city of Troy, far across the sea, and after long wandering had come at last to the shores of Italy. From his line, the legend held, the twins were descended. So the Romans gave themselves a noble and ancient origin, tracing their blood back to the heroes of an old and famous war. The early city, the stories say, was short of people, and so Romulus did something telling. He made his new town a refuge, a place of asylum, welcoming the outcasts and the wanderers, the runaways and the landless, all who had nowhere else to go. From its very beginning, then, Rome grew by taking others in, by opening its gates rather than closing them, a habit that would one day help make it great. But a city of such men had too few women, and so the old tale goes. The Romans invited a neighboring people, the Sabines, to a great festival, and there carried off the Sabine women to be their wives. War followed, as it had to. Yet, when the two peoples met at last in battle, the women themselves are said to have rushed between them, pleading for peace between their fathers and their husbands. And peace came. The Romans and the Sabines, rather than destroying one another, joined together into a single people, sharing the city and its rule between them. It was, in legend, the very first of Rome's many absorptions, the swallowing of a rival not by conquest alone, but by union. The pattern was set early. A city that grew by joining others to itself, folding former enemies into its own body. These were only legends. Of course, half-remembered tales dressed up by later Romans who wished to give their city a grand beginning. Yet the legends reveal what the Romans believed about themselves, that they were a people of mingled origins, open to outsiders, made strong by taking others in. And in that belief, however it was clothed in myth, there was a real and important truth about how Rome would rise. Whatever the truth behind the legend, Rome did begin as something very small. It was a modest town of farmers and herders, built on a cluster of low hills beside a bend. In the Tiber, where the river could be crossed and trade could pass. It was not rich, not grand, not powerful. It was one of many small settlements scattered across the plains and hills of Italy, with nothing yet to mark it for greatness. For its first centuries, the stories tell, Rome was ruled by kings. There were said to be 7 of them across those early years, and under them the little town slowly grew. Some of these kings were remembered as wise builders and lawgivers who drained the marshes, raised the first great works, and gave the city its earliest shape and order. The Rome of the kings was learning, slowly, how to be a city. The kings were remembered for very different gifts. One, the second of them, was honored above all for giving Rome its religion, ordering the worship of the gods, setting up the priesthoods, and shaping the calendar of sacred days, where the first king was a warrior. This one was a man of peace and piety, and the Romans looked back on his reign as a quiet, holy time in which the city learned to honor the divine. Another of the kings was remembered for organizing the people themselves. He is said to have carried out a great counting of the citizens, a census, sorting them by their wealth into classes and arranging how they would serve in the army and vote in the assemblies. He is also credited with building the first great wall around the growing city under such kings. Rome was given not only buildings but structure, the bones of a true state. Religion lay close to the heart of Rome from the beginning, and it never left. The Romans believed that the favor of the gods had to be carefully kept, that the proper rites performed in the proper way secured the goodwill of heaven upon the city and its undertakings. This bond between Rome and its gods, faithfully maintained, was felt to be one of the deepest sources of the city's strength and success before any great undertaking, and above all, before war. The Romans sought to read the will of the gods. Priests would watch the flight of birds or examine the entrails of sacrificed animals, looking for signs of favor or warning. No important business was begun without first seeking the blessing of heaven. To the Romans, piety was not weakness, but the very foundation of their fortune, and they believed they had risen because they honored the gods. Among the most sacred of all were the priestesses who tended the eternal flame of the city's hearth, a fire that was never allowed to go out. So long as that flame burned, it was believed. Rome itself endured. These women were held in the highest honor, sworn to their service for many years, and the unbroken burning of their sacred fire was a living symbol of the unbroken life of Rome. In those early days, Rome fell under the influence of its more advanced neighbors to the north, a people skilled in craft and building and the arts of the city. From them, the Romans learned a great deal, taking in their knowledge of engineering, of building in stone, of drainage and ritual and trade. The small town by the river absorbed the skills of those around it and grew stronger and more capable for the learning. But the age of kings came to a bitter end. The last of Rome's kings was remembered as a cruel and arrogant tyrant, a man who ruled by fear and force, who put men to death without trial and ignored the counsel of the city's elders. His pride and his cruelty turned the people against him, and a great anger gathered slowly beneath the surface of the city, waiting only for a spark. The spark, the old story tells, came through a terrible wrong done by the king's own son to a noble and virtuous woman, a wrong so grievous that it set the city aflame with outrage. The people rose up, led by men of the leading families, and they drove the king and all his family out of Rome forever. The monarchy was overthrown, and the Romans swore that they would never again be ruled by a king. This was the great turning point in the year 509 before the Common Era. Out of the fall of the last king, the Romans built something new, a republic, a state without a king, in which power would be shared and held in check, and no single man would ever again rule alone. This deep hatred of kingship, born in the overthrow of a tyrant, would shape Rome for the next 500 years. In place of a king, the Romans set two leaders, called consuls, who would govern together. And here was the heart of their design. There were two of them, not one, so that each could check the other, and neither could seize sole power. And they held office for only a single year, after which they had to step down. Power was to be shared, and power was to be temporary, always. Behind the consuls stood the Senate, a council of elders drawn from the leading families, men of experience who had held high office. The Senate did not pass laws by itself, but its advice carried enormous weight, and it guided the affairs of the state, especially in matters of war, money, and dealings with other peoples. For centuries, the Senate was the steady, enduring heart of the Republic, outlasting each year's consul. And there were assemblies of the citizens too, gatherings in which the people of Rome could vote, electing their leaders and approving or rejecting laws. The Roman Republic was a careful balance of these parts. The consuls who led, the Senate which advised, and the assemblies of the people. Power was divided among them, each holding something the others lacked, so that no single part could rule without the rest. The Romans came to express the spirit of this arrangement in a famous phrase: the Senate and the people of Rome. It was carved on monuments and carried on the standards of the army. 4 letters standing for that idea that Rome belonged not to a king, but to its Senate and its people together. It was the soul of the Republic put into a few proud letters, marching at the head of the legions. Yet the early Republic was far from equal. In its first days, power lay almost entirely in the hands of the old noble families, the patricians, who held the offices and filled the Senate and controlled the priesthoods. Below them was the great mass of common citizens, the plebeians, the farmers and craftsmen and soldiers who made up most of Rome, and who at first had little say in how the city was run. This imbalance led to a long and remarkable struggle, played out not mostly in blood, but in a kind of slow, stubborn pressure. The common people of Rome, the plebeians, wanted a real share in the city they fought and worked for, and they found a powerful way to demand it. When their grievances grew too great, they would simply leave, withdrawing from the city altogether. For the plebeians were the backbone of the army, and without them, Rome could not fight or work. And so, when they were pushed too far, they would march out of the city in a body and refuse to return until their demands were met. This withdrawal, repeated across the years, was a weapon stronger than any sword, for a Rome without its common people was no Rome at all. Again and again, it won them ground. Through this long contest, the plebeians gradually gained rights and protection. They won officials of their own, called tribunes, whose task was to defend the common people and who could block actions that would harm them, step by step. Over many years, the plebeians forced their way into the offices, and the priesthoods once closed to them, until at last the highest positions in the state lay open to them as well. One of their greatest victories was the writing down of the law. In the early days, the laws of Rome were unwritten, known only to the patrician few, who could bend them as they pleased. The plebeians demanded that the laws be set down in writing for all to see, and at last they were carved onto tablets and set up in the public square. For the first time, the law of Rome was open to every citizen, a thing all could know. This blending, slow and often tense, gave Rome a peculiar strength. Rather than tearing itself apart, the city found ways to widen its circle, to bring the common people into the workings of the state, to bend without breaking. This capacity to absorb and to adapt, to share power rather than hoard it until it shattered, would prove to be one of the deepest secrets of Rome's long rise. The Romans prized certain virtues above all, and these too lay beneath their rise. They admired discipline, duty, and steadiness, the quiet endurance of hardship for the good of the whole. They honored the man who did his work and kept his word, who served the city without seeking glory for himself, who was firm in adversity and modest in success. These were the values they told their children, the bedrock of the Roman character. There is an old story they love to tell of a man called from his plough to save the city. When Rome was in grave danger, the story goes, the Senate turned to a humble farmer, a man of great wisdom and honor, and made him dictator with absolute power to meet the crisis. He left his fields, took command, defeated the enemy, and then, his task done, laid down his power at once and returned quietly to his farm. To the Romans, that was the ideal. Power taken up only out of duty and given back the moment it was no longer needed. The strength of Rome rested also upon its army, which became, over the centuries, the finest fighting force of the ancient world. The Roman soldier was not a wild warrior, but a disciplined one, trained to fight in tight, ordered ranks, to obey, to hold the line. The Roman army won not so much by ferocity as by organization, by discipline, by the refusal to break, and by sheer relentless persistence. The great unit of the Roman army was the legion, a body of thousands of men organized with remarkable care into smaller groups, each with its officers and its place in the line. This structure made the army flexible and steady, able to maneuver and to hold together under pressure, and the Roman soldier was made to dig as well as to fight, building a fortified camp each night, raising walls and ditches wherever the army stopped. The Roman soldier carried a short stabbing sword, made for close and deadly work in the press of battle, and a heavy throwing spear that he would hurl at the enemy before closing in. The legions learned to fight in flexible groups that could open and close, advance and replace their tired front ranks with fresh men, so that the line never wearied and never broke. It was a machine of war, unlike anything its enemies could match. Discipline in the legions was famously severe. A soldier who failed in his duty could face harsh punishment, and a unit that fled in cowardice might, in the worst cases, be punished by lot. A portion of its own men put to death as an example to the rest. It was hard beyond our imagining, but it forged an army that would stand and fight when others ran, that obeyed without question and held its ground to the last. Each legion carried a sacred standard, an eagle of silver or gold, into battle, and to lose it was the deepest disgrace. To recover it, a sacred duty. The eagle was the soul of the legion, and men would die to protect it. Around these standards the soldiers rallied, and in them the pride and honor of the army were gathered, carried at the head of the marching ranks across the world. And when a great victory was won, Rome honored its triumphant general with a magnificent procession through the city, a triumph in which the victor rode in a chariot through cheering crowds, displaying his captives and his spoils. It was the highest honor a Roman could win, and the desire for it drove generals to bold and relentless campaigns. The hunger for glory, for the triumph and the honor of the people, was itself an engine of Rome's expansion. The Romans were builders as much as fighters, and this too served their power. Wherever their armies went, they built roads, hard, straight, durable roads of stone that ran across the land For mile upon mile, these roads let armies march swiftly to wherever they were needed, and let messages and trade flow along them. The famous Roman roads were not only marvels of engineering, but instruments of power, binding the growing Roman world together. With this disciplined army and this gift for building and binding, Rome began slowly to spread its power across Italy. It fought its neighbors, the other peoples of the Italian peninsula, in war after war across many generations. Some it defeated in battle, some it won over, some it absorbed, little by little, decade by decade. The small city by the Tiber extended its reach across the land around it. It was not an easy or a smooth rise. Rome suffered terrible defeats along the way. In its earlier years, a fierce band of warriors from the north, the Gauls, swept down into Italy, crushed a Roman army, and sacked the city of Rome itself, burning much of it. It was a catastrophe, a deep wound in the memory of the city. And yet, Rome did not fall. It recovered, rebuilt, and went on, more determined than before. This was perhaps the most striking thing about Rome's rise: the refusal to give up. Time and again, Rome was beaten, its armies destroyed, its lands ravaged, and time and again, it simply raised new armies and fought on, absorbing defeat after defeat without ever accepting that it had lost. This grim endurance, this unwillingness ever to surrender, wore down enemy after enemy who could win battles, but could not make Rome admit defeat. Rome's hardest struggle for Italy was against the tough mountain peoples of the Central Highlands, with whom it fought a series of long and grinding wars across many decades. These were stubborn and capable enemies, and Rome suffered humiliating reverses against them before at last prevailing. It was in these long Italian wars, more than anywhere, that Rome learned to fight, to endure defeat, and to keep coming back until the victory was won. Toward the south, Rome came into conflict with the wealthy Greek cities along the Italian coast, and one of them called in a famous warrior king from across the sea to fight On its behalf, this king brought a fine army and war elephants, beasts the Romans had never faced, and he beat the Romans in battle more than once. But his victories cost him so dearly. In his own best men, that they did him little good. After one such bloody success, the king is said to have remarked that another victory like it would ruin him utterly. From his words comes a phrase we still use, a costly triumph that is almost as bad as a defeat. In the end, unable to bear such losses, the king withdrew from Italy, and the Greek cities of the south fell to Rome. The newcomer with his elephants had won his battles and lost his war. As Rome conquered, it planted colonies of its own citizens in the conquered lands, settlements that served as strongholds and as seeds of Roman life, knitting the new territories to the city. And it bound the peoples of Italy to itself by treaties, requiring them to send soldiers for Rome's wars, while leaving them much of their own freedom. This vast web of colonies and allies became the foundation of Roman power, a network of loyalty and strength spread across the whole peninsula. By around the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, after long and hard fighting, Rome had become the master of all Italy. The city that had begun as one small town among many now led a great network of peoples across the peninsula, bound to Rome by treaty, by alliance, and by force. From a village on the Tiber, Rome had grown to rule a land of millions. The way Rome held this growing dominion was as important as how it won it. Rome did not simply crush and enslave those it conquered. Often, it offered them alliance, a place within the Roman system, and sometimes even a share in Roman citizenship itself. Conquered peoples could become partners, bound to send soldiers to Rome's armies, but keeping much of their own life, and even, in time, becoming Romans themselves. This was a profound source of strength, where other powers ruled only by fear, and so were always one defeat away from collapse. Rome wove its subjects into itself, turning former enemies into allies and even into citizens. Each new people added to Rome's strength rather than only to its burdens. The more Rome conquered, the more soldiers and resources it could draw upon. A rising tide that fed upon itself. Having mastered Italy, Rome now came face to face with a far greater rival across the sea to the south. This was Carthage, a rich and powerful city on the coast of North Africa, the heart of a great trading empire that dominated the Western Mediterranean. Carthage was older and wealthier than Rome, with a mighty navy and far-flung colonies, mistress of the sea, where Rome was master of the land. The rivalry between these two great powers led to a series of long and terrible wars, 3 of them in all, fought across more than a century. They are remembered as the Punic Wars, and they were among the greatest struggles of the entire ancient world. Upon their outcome would hang the question of who would rule the Western Mediterranean, the rising power of Rome, or the established might of Carthage. The first of these wars began over the island of Sicily, lying between the two powers, and it dragged on for more than 20 years. At its start, Rome had almost no navy at all, while Carthage ruled the waves. But Rome did something extraordinary. It built a fleet from nothing, learning to fight at sea where it had no tradition. And despite losing whole fleets to storms and battle, it built more and fought on, and in the end, it won. The Romans, knowing they could not easily outsail the skilled Carthaginians, found a clever way to turn a sea battle into the kind of fight they knew best. They fitted their ships with a great hinged boarding bridge, which could be dropped onto an enemy vessel to lock the two ships together. Then the Roman soldiers could storm across as if onto dry land, fighting hand to hand, where their discipline gave them the advantage. By such ingenuity, the landsmen of Rome learned to win at sea. The cost of that first war was staggering. Rome lost fleet after fleet, hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, many to storms rather than the enemy. Any other state might have given up, but Rome, with its deep stubbornness, simply built another fleet and another, paying for them when the treasury was empty by the gifts of its own wealthy citizens, until at last Carthage, exhausted, sued for peace. That first war ended with Rome victorious and Sicily in its hands, its first possession beyond the shores of Italy. It was a sign of what Rome could do, take on a greater sea power, suffer staggering losses, and simply refuse to stop until it had won. But Carthage was wounded, not destroyed, and it nursed its losses and rebuilt its strength. And the rivalry was far from over. The Second War was the most dangerous Rome ever faced, and it brought against Rome one of the greatest generals in all of history. His name was Hannibal, a Carthaginian commander of extraordinary genius, and he conceived a daring and astonishing plan. Rather than wait for Rome to come to him, he would bring the war to Italy itself, marching overland to strike at Rome in its own homeland. To do this, Hannibal led his army, with its war elephants, on an epic march from Spain, across rivers and through hostile lands, and then over the high, frozen passes of the Alps. It was a feat of almost unbelievable boldness and hardship. He lost many men and beasts in the bitter mountains, but he brought his army down into Italy, appearing where Rome least expected him, behind its defences. In Italy, Hannibal proved nearly unbeatable. Again and again he met the Roman armies sent against him, and again he destroyed them, winning victory after victory through his brilliant generalship. In one terrible battle, he surrounded and annihilated a vast Roman army, one of the worst defeats Rome ever suffered, a day of slaughter that left the city reeling and its allies wavering. That battle became famous forever as a masterpiece of generalship. Hannibal let his center give way before the Roman charge, drawing the great Roman host forward into a trap, and then closed his wings around them on both sides, encircling the entire army and destroying it almost to a man. For centuries afterward, commanders studied that day, the perfect battle of encirclement, the dream of every general who came after. After such a disaster, Rome turned for a time to a wiser and more patient strategy, devised by a careful old general who saw that Hannibal could not be beaten in open battle. Instead, he shadowed Hannibal's army, harassing it, cutting off its supplies, refusing ever to be drawn into the great battle Hannibal longed for. He was mocked at first for his caution, but his slow, patient strategy bought Rome the time it needed to recover, and his name became a byword for the wisdom of delay. And here Rome's long habit of binding others to itself bore its greatest fruit. For all Hannibal's victories, most of Rome's Italian allies stayed loyal, refusing to join him, denying him the uprising he needed to finish Rome off. The web of alliances and shared citizenship that Rome had patiently woven across Italy held firm under the hardest test imaginable. And it may have been what saved the city in its darkest hour. This was the great test of Rome's endurance. After such defeats, almost any other state would have surrendered or sued for peace. Many of Rome's own allies began to fall away to Hannibal, and it seemed the end might be near. But Rome would not yield. It raised yet more armies, refused to give Hannibal the open battle he wanted, and simply held on, year after year, denying him the final victory that always slipped from his grasp. For all his genius on the battlefield, Hannibal could not take the city of Rome itself, nor force it to surrender. Rome learned to avoid him, to wear him down, to attack Carthage's strength elsewhere while keeping Hannibal at bay in Italy. The Romans struck at Carthage's holdings in Spain, cutting off his support, and slowly the balance began, almost imperceptibly, to turn. At last, Rome found a great general of its own, a brilliant and bold commander who carried the war in a daring new direction. Rather than fight Hannibal endlessly in Italy, he took a Roman army across the sea to Africa to strike at Carthage itself. This forced Carthage to recall Hannibal home from Italy at last, to defend his own city after all his years of victory on foreign soil. The two great generals met at last on the field of Zama in North Africa in the year 202 before the Common Era. There, on African soil, the Roman commander defeated the great Hannibal in open battle, the one defeat the Carthaginian could not overcome. With that victory, the Second War ended, and Carthage was broken as a great power, stripped of its fleet and its empire, left a shadow of what it had been. Rome was now the master of the Western Mediterranean, but the old fear of Carthage lingered. Some in Rome could not rest, while the rival city still stood at all, even humbled and weak. One stern old senator, it is said, ended every speech he gave on whatever subject, with the same grim refrain that Carthage must be destroyed, drop by drop. That relentless demand wore down the will of Rome, until at last it moved to finish its old enemy for good. And so, decades later, Rome found a pretext for a third and final war, and this time there would be no mercy. The Roman armies laid siege to Carthage, and after a long and desperate resistance, the great city fell in the year 146 before the Common Era. Carthage was destroyed utterly. The city that had once rivaled Rome for the mastery of the world was torn down, its people killed or enslaved, its great harbour left silent. The long struggle was over, and Rome stood without a rival in the West. From a town that had begun with almost no navy, Rome had risen to crush the greatest sea power of the age. In the very same years that Rome was destroying Carthage, in the West, it was extending its power eastward as well, into the old and wealthy lands of the Greek world. There, the great kingdoms that had risen after the age of Alexander still stood, rich and cultured, but often quarrelling among themselves. Rome was drawn in, war by war, and one by one these kingdoms fell under its sway. The disciplined Roman legions proved more than a match for the armies of the East, and kingdom after kingdom was defeated, made subject, or swallowed up. The land of Greece itself, the birthplace of so much that the Romans admired, came under Roman control. The Mediterranean world, east and west, was falling piece by piece into the hands of Rome on the battlefields of the east. The flexible Roman legion proved its worth against the old Greek way of war. The Greek armies fought in a great bristling block of long spears, a formation of fearsome power on level ground, but rigid and slow to turn. The Roman lines, broken into smaller, nimble units, could find the gaps, strike from the flank, and fight on broken ground where the great spear block faltered. Again and again, the legion overcame the phalanx. Not every conquest came easily. In the rugged lands of Spain, to the west, Rome fought long, bitter and brutal wars against fierce local peoples, struggles that dragged on for generations and cost it dearly. One small city held out against the might of Rome with such desperate courage that its long resistance became legendary, ending only when its starving defenders chose destruction over surrender. Rome's rise was paid for again and again in such long and bloody campaigns. As its conquests spread, Rome organized the lands it took into provinces, each governed by a Roman official sent out from the city. But this system carried the seeds of trouble. Governors served only briefly and often sought to enrich themselves, and the gathering of taxes was farmed out to private men who squeezed the provinces hard for profit. The empire brought great wealth to Rome, but often through the suffering and resentment of the peoples it ruled. Yet in conquering Greece, Rome was in a sense conquered by it. For the Romans fell deeply under the spell of Greek culture, its art, its learning, its poetry and philosophy and gods. They took Greek teachers into their homes, copied Greek statues, learned from Greek thinkers, and reshaped their own culture in the Greek image. It was said, with truth, that captive Greece took captive her rough conqueror, conquering Rome with her arts, even as Rome ruled her lands. By now, the sea itself had become a Roman sea, the Mediterranean, around which the whole ancient world was gathered, was ringed on every side by Roman power. And the Romans came to call it simply our sea. Ships could sail from end to end of it under Roman protection. The little city by the Tiber had become the center of a vast world, and the waters that joined that world together were its own. But the very success of Rome began slowly to strain the old republic from within. The conquests poured immense wealth into the city, and vast numbers of captives brought back as slaves to work the great estates. The rich grew enormously richer, buying up the land into huge holdings worked by the enslaved, while the small farmers, who had long been the backbone of Rome, found themselves squeezed out, unable to compete. These small farmers had been the heart of the Republic, the citizen soldiers who left their fields to fight and return to them after Now many lost their land and drifted into the city, poor and idle, while the countryside filled with great estates and slaves. A deep and growing gap opened between the wealthy few and the struggling many, and with it came resentment, unrest, and the seeds of conflict. Some Romans saw the danger and tried to set it right. Two brothers, in particular, of a noble family, sought to pass reforms to give land back to the common people and ease the widening divide. But their efforts threatened the wealth and power of the ruling class, and they were met not with debate, but with violence. Both brothers were killed, and their deaths marked a grim turning, the moment when political quarrels in Rome began to be settled with blood. From that point, the Republic entered a long and troubled age. The old restraints that had kept any one man from seizing power began to weaken. Ambitious leaders arose, each seeking to outdo the others, and the careful balance of the Republic strained under their rivalries, the very qualities that had built Rome, its competitive drive and its hunger for honor, now began to turn inward and tear at the state itself. A great change came over the army as well, one that would prove fateful. A leading general, to fill the ranks thinned by the loss of the small farmers, opened the army to the poorest citizens, men who had no land at all. These men served for pay and looked to their general for their reward and their future. And so the soldiers' loyalty began to shift away from the Republic itself and toward the commander who led and provided for them. This was a deep and dangerous transformation. An army loyal to its general rather than to the state was a weapon a powerful man might turn against Rome itself. And before long, that is exactly what happened. For the first time, a Roman general led his army against the city of Rome, seizing power by force. The unthinkable had been done, and once done, it could be done again. That first general to seize Rome by the sword made himself dictator and ruled with a heavy and bloody hand, drawing up lists of his enemies to be hunted down and killed. Yet when he had set the state in order as he wished, he did something that astonished everyone. He laid down his absolute power and retired into private life, as the old heroes had done. It was the last great echo of the old Roman ideal, even amid the ruin of the old Roman order, even in these troubled years. Rome's old habit of widening its circle won one more great victory. The peoples of Italy, who had fought and bled in Rome's armies for centuries, rose at last to demand the full Roman citizenship they had long been denied. After a hard and painful war, Rome granted their demand, extending citizenship across nearly all of Italy. The bitter struggle ended by making the Italians, once subjects and allies, into Romans in full. The decades that followed were torn by civil wars and the rule of strong men, by proscriptions and slaughter, as powerful men fought one another for mastery of the Roman world. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean, but it had not learned how to govern its own success, and the old republic, built for a city-state, buckled under the weight of a world empire. Through it all ran a growing sense that the age of shared power was passing. In the midst of this turmoil came also a great uprising of the enslaved, led by a gladiator whose name has echoed ever since. For a time, his rebel army defeated Roman forces and ranged across Italy, before at last being crushed with terrible severity. It was a reminder of the vast and suffering population on which Rome's wealth was built, and of the violence that lay beneath the surface of its power. Out of the chaos of the late Republic rose men of enormous ambition who gathered power into their own hands as never before. For a time, three of the most powerful joined forces in an informal pact to share the rule of Rome between them, dividing its commands and provinces among themselves. One was the richest man in Rome, one its most celebrated general, and one a rising figure of dazzling ambition. Together, for a while, they held the state in their hands. But such alliances among ambitious rivals could not last. The richest of the three marched east in search of military glory to match the others, and met disaster and death at the hands of a powerful eastern enemy, his army destroyed in the desert, with him gone. Only two great rivals remained, and the bond between them frayed and snapped. The stage was set for a final struggle between the two. mightiest men in the Roman world. The greatest of these men was Julius Caesar, a brilliant general, politician, and writer, ambitious beyond all the rest. He won for himself command of a long war in the lands of Gaul to the north, and over years of campaigning, he conquered vast new territories for Rome, gaining immense wealth, a devoted army, and a fame that outshone all his rivals. By his conquests, he made himself the most powerful man in the Roman world. His conquest of Gaul was a vast and bloody achievement, bringing a great swath of Western Europe under Roman rule. At its climax, the tribes of Gaul united under a single brave chieftain and made their last great stand, besieged in a hill fortress where Caesar's legions surrounded them with miles of walls and trenches. When the fortress fell, the long war was effectively won, and the conquest of Gaul was complete. Caesar even led his legions across the Channel to the misty island of Britain, a place that seemed to the Romans like the very edge of the world. Caesar wrote his own account of these wars in clear and vivid words and sent it home to Rome, where it spread his fame far and wide. He understood, as few did, that glory had to be told as well as won. By the end, his name was on every tongue. His soldiers worshipped him, and the wealth of conquered Gaul flowed through his hands. He had become too great, and his rivals in Rome grew afraid. His rivals in Rome grew fearful of his power and ordered him to give up his command and his army and return as a private citizen. Caesar faced a fateful choice. To obey was to make himself helpless before his enemies. To refuse was to make war on his own country. At the river that marked the boundary of Italy, the Rubicon, he made his decision and led his army across into Italy against Rome. That crossing, in the year 49 before the Common Era, was an act of war, a point of no return, and it plunged Rome into civil war once more. It is said that as he crossed, Caesar declared that the die was cast, the gamble made, the choice beyond undoing. With his battle-hardened legions behind him, he swept down through Italy and his great rival fled before him rather than face him there. The two met at last, far away, in the fields of Greece, where Caesar, though outnumbered, won a decisive victory. His rival fled to Egypt, hoping for refuge, but was murdered as he stepped ashore. There in Egypt, Caesar lingered, drawn into its affairs and to its famous queen, before returning to crush the last resistance to his rule. One by one, his enemies fell, and he made himself master of the entire Roman world. Caesar used his power not only for himself, but to reform the state, reordering its affairs with restless energy. Among his lasting works was a new and far more accurate calendar, reckoned by the sun, which would order the year for many centuries to come, and whose shape we still follow in its essentials to this day. He planned and built and granted citizenship widely, a tireless master of the world he had won. In time, he was named dictator, not for the old brief term of emergency, but for life, holding a power that looked very much like the kingship Rome had cast out so long before. To many Romans, this was the death of the republic they cherished, the return of one-man rule under another name. A group of senators, in the name of the old freedom, conspired against him, and on a day in the year 44 before the Common Era, they struck Caesar down in the Senate itself. They believed they were saving the Republic. In truth, they only plunged Rome into yet more years of war. For Caesar's friends and followers rose up to avenge him, and they hunted down the men who had killed him. In their fury, they drew up lists of their enemies to be killed, and their wealth seized. And among those who perished was Rome's greatest orator, a man who had spent his life defending the old republic with the matchless power of his voice. With his death, one of the noblest voices for Roman liberty fell silent, and an age of free speech in Rome came to its end. The armies of the assassins and the armies of the avengers met far away in Greece, and there the cause of the old republic was crushed upon. The battlefield, its champions, defeated, took their own lives, and with them died the last real hope of restoring the republic of old, the dream of the men who had struck down Caesar perished with them, for Caesar's death did not restore the old republic. It set off another round of civil wars as his followers and his assassins, and then his followers among themselves, fought for control. Out of this final struggle, two great rivals emerged: Caesar's trusted lieutenant and Caesar's young heir. And for a time, they divided the Roman world between them, east and west, before turning at last upon each other. The young heir, a cool and patient man of great political skill, gathered the west behind him, while his rival held the east. Allied with the famous Queen of Egypt, the heir turned the people of Rome against his rival, painting him as a man lost to a foreign queen, no longer truly Roman. Slowly, he gathered the will of Italy and the West to his side, and prepared for the final reckoning. Their rivalry came to its end in a great sea battle fought off the western coast of Greece in the year 31 before the Common Era. There, the heir's fleet broke the power of his rival, who fled the battle with his queen and sailed away to Egypt. Pursued there the following year, the two lovers, seeing all was lost, each took their own life, and the long drama came to its close with their deaths. The rich and ancient land of Egypt itself passed into Roman hands, its vast wealth flowing into the coffers of the victor. The last of the great kingdoms born from Alexander's empire was gone, swallowed by Rome, and the heir stood at last without a rival anywhere in the world, the sole master of all the lands around the Mediterranean Sea. The long age of civil war was over at last. That man took the name by which history remembers him, Augustus, and in the year 27, before the Common Era, he became, in all but name, the first emperor of Rome. He was careful never to call himself a king, that hated word, nor even an emperor in any plain sense. He called himself merely the first citizen, and claimed to have restored the Republic. But in truth, all real power now rested in his hands alone. So, the Republic, in form, lived on, with its Senate and its consuls and its ancient offices. But behind the old forms, the reality had changed forever. One man now held the armies, the provinces, and the final word in all things. The 5 centuries of the Republic, born in the overthrow of a king, had ended in the rule of a single master who reigned as king in everything but name. Augustus was careful and patient where Caesar had been bold and open, and he had learned from his adopted father's fate. He took care to keep the loyalty of the army firmly in his own hands, holding command of the provinces where the legions were stationed, so that the soldiers looked to him alone. He shaped the army into a permanent, professional force, paid and pensioned by the state, and set a guard about himself in the capital. Never again would a rival raise legions against him. Under Augustus, the long ages of conquest at last began to slow. He set the bounds of the empire along great natural frontiers, the broad rivers and the deserts, and after a terrible disaster in which whole legions were destroyed in the dark forests of the north, he chose to halt the endless expansion rather than press on. The empire had grown so vast that holding it now mattered more than enlarging it further. The rise had reached, for a time, its limit, and he ruled for a very long time, more than 40 years, long enough for the old ways of the Republic to fade from living memory, and the new order to settle in as if it had always been. The people who had known the chaos of the civil wars were glad, on the whole, to trade the old freedom for peace and stability. By the time Augustus died, an old man after a long reign, hardly anyone remained who could remember a Rome that was truly free, and the rule of one man seemed simply the way of the world. And yet, after the long agony of the civil wars, this new order brought something the Roman world had not known for generations: peace. Under Augustus and those who followed him, the empire settled into a long age of relative calm and stability, a Roman peace that spread across the whole Mediterranean world. The wars of conquest gave way, for a time, to order, to trade, to building, across an empire that stretched over 3 continents. It would come to be remembered as one of the longest and deepest spells of peace the Western world had ever known, an age that later generations would look back upon with longing. The rise was complete from a small town of farmers on the hills beside the Tiber, Rome had become the master of an empire that reached from the cold rivers of the north to the deserts of the south, from the ocean in the west to the old lands of the east. It had taken many centuries, countless wars, and the slow transformation of the city from a republic into the realm of one man. But the village had become the world's great power, and the things Rome built in its rising long outlasted its power. Its roads still run beneath the fields of Europe. Its language became the root of many, of the tongues still spoken today, and the language of learning for centuries after. Its laws shaped the laws of nations far into the future. The very idea of Rome, of the Republic, of citizenship and law and empire would echo down through all the ages that followed. The language of Rome, Latin, did not die with the empire. It lived on, changing slowly, until it became the parent of a whole family of living tongues, the languages of Italy, of Spain, of France, and of other lands. All of them children of the speech once heard in the Roman Forum, and for many centuries after. Latin remained the language of learning, of law, and of worship across much of the world, the common tongue of the educated, long after Rome itself was gone. Even the very letters in which we write are Rome's gift. The alphabet the Romans used, shaping it for their own language, spread with their power and their writing across the world, and it is, in its essentials, the same alphabet in which countless languages are written to this day. When we set down our words, we are using letters first given their familiar forms by the hands of Roman scribes. The law of Rome was perhaps its most enduring creation of all. Over the centuries, the Romans developed an immense and careful body of law, reasoning out principles of justice, of property, of contract, and of right, with a depth and subtlety unmatched in the ancient world. This Roman law became the foundation upon which the legal systems of many later nations were built, so that the judgments of Roman jurists still echo faintly in the courts of today. The Romans were great builders, and the works of their engineering long outlasted their rule. They mastered the arch and the dome, and a kind of concrete that let them raise structures of a size and strength the world had not seen before. Their bridges, their aqueducts striding across the valleys on rows of arches, their vast domed halls stood for centuries, some of them still standing now, a testament in stone to the ambition and skill of Rome and the long peace that Augustus brought, spreading across the whole Mediterranean world, allowed something rare and precious to flourish. For generations, a merchant or a traveller could journey from one end of the empire to the other, across thousands of miles, under a single law and a single peace, along the great roads and the open sea. Goods and ideas and peoples flowed freely across this vast, connected world in a way that would not be seen again for a very long time after Rome was gone. So great was the memory of Rome that those who came after longed to claim it for themselves. For centuries, ambitious rulers in distant lands took up the title that Rome's masters had borne, calling themselves by names descended from Caesar's own, raising eagles as their emblems, dreaming of restoring the empire of Rome, the very idea of a great and universal empire, of order spread across the world, was a Roman idea, and it haunted the imagination of the West for more than 1,000 years. And in truth, the Roman Empire did not all fall at once. Its eastern half lived on for another 1,000 years. After the West had passed away, guarding much of the old learning and law and faith, still calling itself Roman to the end. The rise we have followed tonight gave way in time to ages of glory and of decline. But the thing that Rome had built proved astonishingly long-lived, outlasting empire after empire that came after. There is a deeper lesson, too, quietly woven through the whole long story. Rome rose as a republic, proud of its freedom, fearful of kings, governed by shared and limited power, and yet, in the end, the very success of that republic, the wealth and the armies and the ambition it unleashed, overwhelmed the old restraints until power gathered once more into a single pair of hands. It is an old and sobering tale of how even the most carefully balanced of states may, under the weight of its own greatness, drift back toward the rule of one. We might wonder at the end why it was Rome that rose so high and not some other city. Part of the answer lay in where Rome stood. It sat near the center of Italy, and Italy near the center of the Mediterranean world, so that Rome was well placed to reach out in every direction. It guarded a crossing of the Tiber on a route of trade amid fertile plains that could feed a growing people. Geography gave Rome a fortunate seat from which to grow. But geography alone explains little. Other cities held good ground and did not conquer the world. What set Rome apart lay more in its character and its ways. There was that deep and stubborn refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to lose battle after battle and still fight on. There was the genius for organization in the army and the state alike. And there was, above all, that rare openness, the readiness to make citizens of the conquered, to grow by joining others rather than only by crushing them. The Romans governed themselves for centuries, not by a single written constitution, but by custom, by the remembered ways of their ancestors, which they revered deeply. A young man seeking to serve the state climbed a recognized ladder of offices, rising step by step through positions of growing responsibility, learning the work of government as he went. This slow, ordered path produced experienced leaders and bound ambition. For a time, within the service of the whole, Roman society was knit together, too, by webs of loyalty between the powerful and the humble. A great man had his followers, whom he protected and helped, and who in turn supported him. A bond of mutual obligation running up and down through every rank. These ties of duty and loyalty gave Roman society a strength and a steadiness, holding it together through hardships that might have shattered a looser people. And the Roman mind was, above all, a practical one. The Romans were not, on the whole, the great originators of ideas, as the Greeks had been, but they were unmatched at putting things to use, at building, organizing, governing, at taking what worked and making it work better. And on a grander scale, they borrowed freely from the Greeks and from everyone else, and bent what they borrowed to the practical business of ruling the world. Even their gods they shaped in this borrowing way. The Romans took the gods of the Greeks and joined them to their own, giving them Roman names and Roman temples, so that the Greek king of the gods became their own, Sky Father, and the Greek goddess of love, their own, and so on through the whole company of heaven. They wove the myths and the gods of the peoples they met into their own faith, a religion that grew like the empire by absorbing what it found. All these things together, the fortunate ground, the iron stubbornness, the gift for order, the openness to outsiders, the reverence for custom, the bonds of loyalty, the practical turn of mind, came together over many centuries to lift one small town above all the rest. No single one of them would have been enough. It was their slow weaving together across 500 years and more that made Rome what it became. So, the story of Rome's rise is not only the story of armies and conquests, it is the story of a people stubborn beyond all reason, who would not accept defeat, who learned to share power at home and to absorb the peoples they conquered abroad, who built roads and laws and a city that became, for a time, the center of the world. From the she-wolf and the river to the empire that ruled the sea. It was a very long and a very slow rise indeed. And so, as the night deepens, we can let the long story settle into quiet. The armies are still now. The Senate is silent. The great roads lie empty under the stars, running on through the dark toward the sleeping city. On its 7 hills, the Tiber moves slowly beneath the old bridges. The lamps of Rome burn low and then go out. The marble cools in the night air. The forum is empty. The voices long since faded. The river flows on through the dark, as it flowed before the city was ever built, as it will flow long after. The hills stand quiet beneath the moon. The far roads vanish into the night. And gradually, the centuries grow faint. their empires soften and blur. The moonlight settles over the river, and the hills, and the silent stones. The story comes to rest. The long rise ended. Only the river now. Only the quiet. Only the slow water moving in the dark, and the long, gentle, breathing quiet of the night.